By the end of this tutorial, hopefully you'll be able to integrate any 3D object into a real-world environment. Like always, if you want to follow along with me, you can download everything I use in the description below. I will be using Nuke X for the compositing for this tutorial. Of course, you can use any other compositing program, but if you still want to work along with us for free, I have a download to Nuke non-commercial, which you can use to follow along with us in the description below. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started in our scene. This is just a default scene in Blender. I'm going to go ahead and delete the cube and the light, and then hit 0 to come into our camera view. Then I'm just going to come up here, select the camera, go to the camera settings, go to background images, and then add an image, and we're going to go ahead and hit movie clip and open our clip. So here's the footage. I'm just going to open that up. And then we need to go ahead and I'm going to hit Shift A, add a mesh plane. I'm just going to scale that up a little bit. And then if you actually come up here to view and then navigation and come down to the walk navigation, if we select that, we can now WASD and move around our scene. We're basically just trying to align the floor with the plane that we created in our camera. So with that there, I'm going to select our camera, then just GZ, move that down a little bit. And then I may move, hit R and then X to move it on the X. And then again, GZ, just move it down. We're basically just trying to match our plane to the water. Okay, so this is the result I'm getting. I'm just going to size up the plane a little bit. And it doesn't have to be perfect since the camera isn't moving. So as long as it's in the rough ballpark, that should be fine. Let's go ahead and set up some render settings. So I'm going to come to render, going to change it to cycles, GPU compute. Going to turn denoise off since it slows down my computer. And then I'm going to make this a 64 sample count. And the viewport also is 64. So let's go ahead and add an object in the scene. Now you can add any object that you want. I'm just going to kind of do this abstract kind of floating orb type thing, just because I thought it looked cool and, you know, was kind of the vibe I was wanting to go for. So for me, I'm going to go ahead and Shift A, add a mesh. I'm going to go to UV sphere, and then we can just scale that down by hitting S. I'm going to move that up right around like this area. And then if I right click on that and shade smooth, now we can see that we don't have the mesh showing anymore. So in order to make my object, I'm going to go ahead and come here, go into edit mode by hitting tab. And then I want to go ahead and smooth this out. We don't have enough vertices to work with for now. So if I come to the modifier section, I want to go ahead and add a subdivision surface modifier. And the base settings here are fine if both those are just 2. And then now we can see we have a smoother sphere. So I'm just going to go ahead, hit 2 to go into edge select mode. And then if you hold Alt and select, and if you select kind of close to where the points connect, you can select the different edge loops. I want to select the one in the exact middle, kind of going long ways. And then if I go ahead and Control B to bevel that, and then if I scroll with my mouse wheel up 1 unit, it'll add kind of a loop in the middle. And I kind of want those a little bit tighter, so something like that. And then if we kind of scroll in here, we want to select that edge loop again. So Alt click that. So now we have the middle edge loop. I'm just going to S to scale that in. And so now we kind of have a little bit of a line going in our object. I'm just going to go ahead and Control R to add some edge loops here and just kind of bring that in just so the sides are not as curved as they were before. So now if we come back out of edit mode, I'm going to go hit tab. We can see that we have this object. I think it's more interesting if it's rotated. So if I double tap R, we can go into the trackball setting, and I'm just going to set it like that up a little bit. So if we rotate it on the Z, so RZ, you can see that the seam is kind of, you know, doing this effect. So let's go ahead and add some animation to this. Now I don't want to deal with like any keyframe animation because that's going to be a lot to do. I basically just want the animation to be the ball rotating constantly at a constant speed. And so a good way to do that is to come over to the object properties. I'm gonna rotate this on the Z. You can see that's kind of the direction we want to do. And so if I go ahead and click inside of there, I can hit hashtag, and that will basically create an expression, which is basically a code that Blender is going to use to animate that property and give us a value for each frame. And so if I type in hashtag frame, that's going to give us the frame that we're on. And so you can see that every single frame, it basically updates that, and it's spinning very, very fast. We don't really want it to spin that fast. So what we can do is come in here, and if we have this frame selected, I'm going to hit divided by 10. So it's going to take whatever that frame number is and then divide that number by 10, which gives us a much slower rotation. So now we have something like this. You can of course play around with it however you want and add some cool animation for yourself. Now I want the orb to kind of be bobbing up and down, and so what I'm going to go ahead and do is let's bring a new tab out here. Then I go to the graph editor, and then if we go ahead, we want to set a keyframe for the position. So over here, if we just hit I and then go to a location keyframe, now we can drop this down and we have all this location data. And so what I want to do is for the Z location, you can see that's the up and down movement of our orb. We can actually set that to basically bob up and down with some noise. So if I come over to the modifiers tab, if you don't see that, just hit N over here to reveal that. And then you want to hit noise, and we can just scale that up a little bit. And then the strength we want way down, so maybe like a 0.1. Let's see what that is doing. So yeah, so you can see that it's basically bopping up and down. It's a little too fast for me still, so I'm going to set the scale up until we get something like that, just so it's basically floating in our scene and giving us some dynamic movement. So now that we have that, I'm just going to close out of here, join the areas. And so now we have this as our scene. Let's go to the rendered view just to see everything that we're working with. So we don't have any lighting in our scene and we can't see the background anymore. So the first thing we need to do is come over here, render to filmic, film, and then transparent. And now we can see the background again. Then let's go ahead and add some lighting in our scenes. I'm going to come over to the world properties, and then if you downloaded the HDRI I have in the description, you can come to the environment texture, and then we're going to open that HDRI. So here it is. You just want to click on that and then open the image. And now we have lighting data baked in our scene. I try to match the HDRI as close to our environment, so we have rocks and it's kind of foggy, no really direct sunlight. And so now we have this white kind of floor here. What we actually want to do to get good reflections for our orb is to go ahead and project the image onto that plane. This is used a lot in visual effects, so this is very important for you guys to learn if you do want to integrate into your actual 3D environment. So let's come up here. I'm going to go to add a new material. Just going to name this footage. Let's bring out a new window. So right there, I'm going to come to the shader editor. Like that. And then what we need to do with our footage up here, we don't need the principled BSDF because we're not going to be rendering out any shadows with our scene. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. What we do need to add though, if you shift A, add a image texture and then plug the color into the surface here. And then we just want to open up our footage again. So here is the clip, open image. And you can see it now has the image, but it's being projected weirdly, and it's also not updating to our actual movie clip. So what we need to do is, first of all, make it set to auto refresh right there. And then if you have the Node Wrangler add-on, if we come up here to edit preferences, add-ons, Node Wrangler, you just want to make sure that's checked. And with that add-on, we can go ahead and hit Control T with that selected, and it adds a texture coordinate and mapping node. So with that, we want it to project from the window view, which will basically project this texture onto our plane. And since we're looking through the camera, it's going to project it from our view there. You'll notice that there's kind of these weird clipping issues outside of the camera. And so what I like to do is actually come up here to, instead of repeat, if we set that to mirror, it's basically just going to give us a nicer fall off outside of our camera. Okay, so now that we have our plane object textured, we actually need to go ahead and texture the ball. I've linked a couple of textures I'm going to be using, so let's go ahead and add a new texture. I'm just going to name this orb. And then with the principled BSDF, with the Node Wrangler add-on, if you hold Shift, Control, and then T, it opens up a texture mapping window. And so what you need to do is locate all the textures that you downloaded. Here's the first texture from Polygon. So I'm just going to select all these textures. You don't have to select this kind of thumbnail texture that they have, and hit principled texture setup. And so now what that has basically done is set up all these texture nodes and plug them into the principled BSDF with the corresponding textures. So now if we zoom into the ball, we can see that we have all of our materials onto the object. If you do want to, play around with the scale of the texture, I like to just add a value node in here and plug it into scale. And so I think the scale is fine for me, so I'm just going to set it to 1. But if you do want to increase it or anything like that, you can always set it here. But again, I'm just going to set it to 1. So next thing I want to do is kind of rough this up a little bit, because if I come in here, you'll notice that the texture that we're using is very clean, and rarely in real life is anything very clean. Everything has like some scratches, some scuffs, maybe some fingerprints to it. So I want to try to get that as realistic as possible. I also downloaded this texture, so if you just want to go ahead and bring out the normal map, I'm just going to drag and drop that, and it creates a new node inside of here. Very important is that since we're doing a normal map, it's going to be set to sRGB. You actually want to go ahead and set that to be a non-color, just to get it in the right color space for that. And then we can come over here. We see we have this normal already. We're not going to end up using that, so I'm just going to delete that. Also, the displacement we're not really going to see, so I'm just going to delete both of those. And so now if I bring our kind of scratch layer up here, plug the color into the color of our normal. And so now if we zoom in here, we can see very few kind of scratches and stuff. If we actually want to kind of increase the scale of that, I'm going to go ahead and Control T again to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And then if we just add a value, plug that into the scale like we did before, let's try like a value of 2. It's very hard to see right now, so if I actually shift control click right here, we can kind of see the actual texture. I'm actually going to go ahead and just view our normal map over here. So now you can see some of the scratches. I want to increase the scratches somewhere like around there is looking about the right size. You can play around with it for your own scene. And then let's just go back to the principled BSDF. I'm still not seeing many of the scratches, so I might change the strength up to like a 2. Maybe a little bit higher, maybe like a 3 or something like that. So now we can start seeing some scratches on our actual object here. Okay, so that is all the materials done. Now we actually need to go ahead and we can join the areas. And we need to go ahead and set up some things to actually render this out. So the first thing that I like to do is I want to set this to be only affecting the indirect properties of this orb. We don't want this to be rendered. We only want it to be affecting kind of the reflection and the shadows or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is make a new collection up here. I'm going to just call that the reflection collection, place our plane inside of there, and then let's just make sure we click back out into the scene collection. So now if we go up here, I'm going to change this little indirect only button on, and if we click that now, we can see that we can no longer see it through our camera. However, the shadows and everything and the reflections from our orb are still there. If I was to turn this off, then we can see that the entire scene has changed. We don't have any of those reflections from our floor anymore, and so we just want to make sure that's on and the indirect only is on. Okay, so we are pretty much done. What I will notice in this scene is that we have water right here, which is very reflective. So a workflow that I really like for this specific shot is to actually go ahead and add a modifier and basically use that to add a second orb down here, and then we can use that for compositing. So what I want to do is with the orb selected, I'm just going to come up here to the modifiers, and then we're going to add a mirror modifier right here, and then you can see that's basically duplicated our orb and just placed it in there. What we actually want to do is set the mirror object to be our plane. And so since the plane is kind of on the exact floor that our water would be in the shot, it's going to reflect that across. You can see it's not doing anything now. It's actually duplicated over there. And so what I want to do is go ahead and instead of doing the x-axis, we can actually go ahead and do the z-axis. So now we can see the orb is actually below our plane. We're having a little bit of shading issues just because our plane is still affecting the shadows of our HDRI. So to change that, I'm going to come up to the object properties, going down to the visibility, and then if we just check shadow to be off, now that plane won't affect our shadow, but it will still affect our reflections and everything. So now we are pretty much ready to go ahead and render the animation. I'm going to come to our output properties. I am going to be rendering in PNG today, so we want to make sure we have the alpha. And then if we change the compression down to 0 and then save a new folder location. So I'm just going to name it orb v3 for my version and then underscore at the end, just so I can separate the actual text from the numbers. And then we can hit accept. And if we go ahead, let's render out an image first just to make sure that we're rendering everything correctly before we actually render the full animation. Let's quickly change some render settings just to kind of get us some higher quality. So come up to render properties. I'm going to set my sample count to be a 256. And then I'm not going to denoise this one since there's not going to be too much noise in this, but of course you can set it to however you want. Next, I'm going to come down to light paths. I'm going to change these all down to like a 3. If you just click and drag down, you can select all of them at once. For this, I'm just going to change the caustics off since we don't really have any caustics in this scene. And then fast GI approximation, I'm going to change these to 2. Just to kind of speed up our scene. We do want motion blur on, and we do want to simplify our scene. And all those settings are kind of just what works for me for getting faster renders. So with that, I'm going to come up here and render the animation. Okay, so now that that's finished, let's go ahead and go into compositing. Now you can do compositing in Blender, but I highly recommend against it. A good free alternative is DaVinci Resolve. However, I'm going to be working in Nuke X today. Again, you can follow along with me using Nuke Non-Commercial, which I'll link in the description for you to download and try for free. So let's go ahead and read in our footage by hitting R, so we can go ahead and import that in. You want to find wherever you saved your image sequence. So here is my image sequence. I'm just going to open that up. And then if you click on a node and hit 1, we can actually view that. I'm going to come up to workspace and then just go to large viewer, just so we can see that a little bit easier. We also want to go ahead and read our footage, so R and then go to the footage. Okay, so just open that up and let's go ahead and combine them real quick. So I'm just going to hit M to merge those. Think of the merge as kind of an alpha over like in Blender compositing. So now we have that. You'll notice that we have this white band kind of around our orb, and that's actually because we haven't pre-multiplied our footage. So I'm going to add a pre-mult node right below our read. Okay, so now that we have them combined, you'll notice that we have the 2 orbs here, and I basically want to try to separate those into their own passes in order to affect them separately from each other. And so to do that, what I'm going to do is basically add a roto node. So first of all, before I forget, let's come up to S. We want to make sure we have our render properties set. You just want to make sure you have it on HD 1080p because our footage was in 1080p, and then the frame rate we just want to be on 23.976, which is the frame rate of my footage. And then also the end range is going to be 250 because that's the end of our orb thing. I could have rendered out longer for the full length of the clip, but we're just going to be working in the 250 frame range. So let's just exit out of all that. So now with that set up, we can go ahead and hit O on our keyboard to add in a roto node. And what I want to do is I want to kind of find, if I view the orb node, I want to find the lowest point that the orb gets. So somewhere around there. So this is kind of the lowest the orb gets, around frame 32. If we just go ahead and with the roto node, make sure you have this spline tool over here. We just want to click and kind of make a very, very rough box shape that will encompass the entire timeline of our orb at the top. And so with that now selected, I'm going to go ahead and hit tab, add a channel merge node. And this will basically allow us to merge our alpha channels to solo out the top orb. So if I plug the A into our orb and then the B into our roto, if I just set the operation to be multiply, it's basically going to take the multiplication of the alpha of our roto, which is basically just a box right there, and then the alpha of our orb, which is a circle, and multiply all those values together to basically just erase everything outside of our little box that we made. And so I'm just viewing that, by the way, by hitting A over here. You can also come up here and change the different modes, but A is just a shortcut. So now that we have our alpha channel kind of soloed out over here, we need to copy that into our main stream here. So of course, we're just going to add a copy node by hitting K, and then we can plug that in. And then the A side, we want to be our channel merge node. And so what that will do is it'll basically copy the alpha from our channel merge, which is the now erase the bottom orb. And then it's copied it into our mainstream. And once we pre-multiplied it, it now basically gets rid of that bottom ball. And so now we need to get the bottom ball back. Let's come, I'm going to drag these down here. What I like to do is go ahead and add a postage stamp just so we can keep everything organized that came down here. And I'm going to plug that into the read one. And then if I come and hit hide input here, we now have a link without duplicating the footage. We now have a link that kind of organize our scene. I'm just going to copy all these nodes that we already created right here. We need to do the same exact thing, but now inverted as our roto. So if I plug the B here and then the A here, we'll see that we basically have the same result. But what I want to do is with our roto node, instead of having this white and this black, we want to have the opposite. So we want this part to be white, and then the part that we rotoed we want to be black. So I'm just going to add a invert node right there, and so now that's basically inverted that, and now we have the second ball down here. We still need to combine it in our mainstream again, since it's not really being combined. So M to merge those, and I'm going to put the A over here. And so now we have basically we had before, but we have them separated now, so we can affect them separately. Okay, so now let's get into the compositing. Let's go ahead and color correct our footage. So what I'm going to do is hit G to add a gray node, and we want to go ahead and try to match our white and black values. So if I'm going to disable this by hitting D, and then the black point, I want to go to our first footage, and I want to find the darkest point in our orb up here. So if I come up to the top, you see this Y value, and that's basically the luminance and our gamma of our scene. And so I'm just going to crank that down until we see kind of up until we see kind of some of the darker areas. And so obviously we can see in here are some of the shadow areas. So I'm going to try to find like the darkest here, which is looking like this little pixel here. So if I click on this node, I can control and then click that pixel to set that color. And then we're just going to do the opposite with the white value. You can control click that to reset it. I'm just going to bring the gamma down, and the kind of brighter values are the values we're looking for. And so it's somewhere up here. So I'm going to come up here, and we'll just say it doesn't need to be exact for this scene, but we'll just say kind of in there is the highest value there. And then of course we just want to do the opposite with the footage now. And we want to go ahead and see the darkest values. What you will notice is that some areas right here are pure black. You don't want those because those just don't have any data in this. So what we actually want is like some of these purple areas. So like maybe like right here that it looks darker there. And so I'm going to select some of those pixels, and then same for the white value. Let's just kind of darken there. Again, we don't want any of this blown out white area. We want kind of some of these areas like here. So maybe there, if we control click that, I'm going to select my pixel range to be in there. And so now back out of here, I'm just going to control right click to remove that red dot. And then let's view the footage. Here's before the grade. And then now if we disable that, we can now see that that basically has matched our white point, and it's looking much more integrated in our scene. I'm going to go a step further and go ahead and gamma correct this. So if you come over here, hit R to go to the red channel, we can now affect just the red channel in here. So I'm going to increase it, kind of just eyeballing it, seeing what looks correct. And then G to go into the green channel. Again, we got it pretty close. It's just black and white kind of values. There's a little bit of green over here, then blue finally. Blue I notice is a little bit darker, so somewhere around there I think is looking pretty good. Might even decrease the green just a tad and bring the blue in a little bit. So now you can see if I turn this on and off, we now have the orb actually graded into our scene and matching the colors. So now you can see we're only affecting the top orb. So of course, let's copy and paste that into the stream. It's very important. You want to do any color correction before your pre-multiplication node, just to make sure that you have all the edges correct. But now that is looking good. Let's go ahead and look at kind of this bottom orb. Now we'll need to do a lot of things with reflections. And so this is a very complicated thing to do inside of Nuke, but here's a good workflow that I found. What we want to go ahead and do is we want to add a eye distort node. So if you just type in distort, you'll see this, and we want to add that in. And we want to add that in like somewhere around here. We can maybe change that a little bit. And so what that needs, if we come up here, we need UV channels to actually affect how the distortion is going to go. And so what better channels to use than the actual channels of our base footage? So if I come and view our footage, and if I go to like the red channel or the green channel or the blue channel, we can now see that we have a lot of black and white values that we can use to influence the distortion of our actual reflection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, again, add a copy node by hitting K. I want to put that above our distortion node, and whatever our A socket is what we're copying from. So I want to put that from our footage. And then here we want to copy, basically this is the from, and then this is the to. And so we want to copy, let's say, our green channel, and then we want to copy that into a random channel that it's going to be using. So I like to use a forward.u. And then we also need to have another channel, since it's going to be 2 channels that the distort node needs. So I'm going to set this to be the RGBA blue, and then set that to be our forward V. And so now we have a UV channel in this data stream. And so if we come back to the distort node, I'm going to set our UV channel to be that forward thing that we just created. And so now if we view that down here, if we go ahead and set the UV scale up like that, you can now see that whatever channels we have affecting here are actually going to be distorting the image down here. So what I do notice is that we have it a little bit flipped. And so what I'm going to do is going to go ahead and add a invert node right here. Just because I find that, you got to play around with it. Again, I don't know the total workflow for this, but I just found that you had to invert the color footage for the forwards to work. Kind of weird there. So play around with that, get a result how you wanted. Also, if I go into disable the distort node, you'll notice that our ball is very far away now. And so what we can do is actually go ahead and UV offset that and get that a little bit closer to where it was before. So now it's a little bit, in line with where the reflection would actually be. Okay, so that reflection is looking pretty good. What we do need to do, of course, is go ahead and defocus both of these to match the focus level of our footage. So let's go ahead and add a defocus here. And then let's just get real kind of tight up close to it. And the focus is definitely going to be larger here. We do want to make sure we do that after our distortion. And so I'm just going to try to match it as closely as possible. Like that. That is looking good. And then I'm just going to do the same thing. So duplicate our defocus. I'm going to add it to the orb above. And then again, we need to get super close to the edge of this to blend it in with kind of where it would be in Z space. So somewhere like around there, maybe. That's looking pretty good. So you can see that it just matches it more into our scene. So now the two are focused. What's very weird though is that we're still seeing kind of, it's not that realistic of a reflection. And what I find, if you come over here and kind of view the reflection of the rocks and stuff, is that we don't have kind of this solid, kind of orb looking thing reflection on everything. It's going to be very choppy. The water is going to be reflecting light off of different, bouncing, and it's going to be a lot of reflection data. So we want to try to copy that as much as possible. And so what I'm going to do to kind of use that is, again, we want to use the footage to affect that. So I'm going to go ahead and add a keyer right here. And that's going to be set automatically to a luminance key, which is exactly what we want, because it'll take the luminance values if we hit A to go over to alpha. And then we can just affect this A and B thing. And that will basically just give us a range kind of this footage like that. So something like that, we can change that a little bit later. And then let's plug the mask into that. And now if we come back over to the B, we can now see that we have areas where we're not getting that much reflection, and then areas where it's reflecting very well. And so we might want to blur this in a bit because we're getting some harsh edges and stuff here. So I'm going to go ahead and add a blur node. Our nodes are super disorganized up here, so maybe take some time to organize them if you want. I'm just going to blur it a little bit, something like that. And so that is looking pretty good. You can, of course, play around with the scene and get a result that you want. I might play around with the luminance key a little bit and kind of get some of these reflections more in there. Something like that. Again, you can kind of play around with it on your own, but this is a nice workflow because we're actually using the actual footage to get our reflection data. So that's what I'm going to stick with for now. What I'm also going to do is come to the merge of our, orb like that. And if I decrease the mix, I just want a little bit of an opacity thing just to get, some more of the ripples and stuff in our actual footage. So now our reflection is looking much more realistic, and it should hopefully be deforming with the actual ripples and giving us a very realistic result. So the final thing that I want to do is go ahead and match the grain for our footage. If I come to the blue channel, which is where you can see the most amount of grain, then kind of zoom in here and turn the gamma up just a little bit. If I just play it a little bit, let's set an endpoint outpoint just so you can see, you'll notice that there's a lot of grain and kind of, you know, pixelated parts of the image, and that's actually to do with compression, but also just kind of the camera it was shot in captured grain with the actual, you know, data within the image. So we want to match that as closely as possible. So to do that, I'm going to go add a grain node and then bring this down here. What I find works best is you want to find a part of the image that roughly follows the color and luminance of your object. So I'm going to go ahead and add a transform node. Then just temporarily, I'm going to move this kind of over here just because some of these rocks are match more of the, you know, kind of luminance of the orb. Then let's just play that. I'm going to go into the red channel first. So we just want to break this down by channels. And so in this node, I'll notice that the intensity is way too much. So I'm going to bring that down, try to match that closer. So something like that. The size is actually pretty decent. I'm seeing a lot of like H.264 artifacts, you know, those big kind of blocks. And so I don't really know yet how to add that. So I'm just going to leave that for now. We can go to the green channel by hitting G. Gonna just do that the same. Trying to match that as closely as possible like that. I might even turn the gain up just a little bit just to see some of the finer details. And then if we hit B to go to the blue channel, just going to decrease that as well. Blue I always find is kind of your most grainy of the channels. And so there we go. So that is looking pretty good. Let's turn the gain back off. And so yeah, so that's giving us a pretty good grain result. I might turn the red down just a tiny bit. There we go. So that is looking good. It looks like our green is matching pretty well there. And let's go ahead and get rid of that transform node so it's back in the original position. And then I think we are ready to go ahead and render this out. I'm going to go add a write node by hitting W and then save our file. Okay, you can name your file whatever you want. And then I'm just going to do .mov. I'm just going to save it as MOV for this, but you can of course save it as an image sequence, whatever you want. I find the default values are fine for what I need. If I'm rendering straight to YouTube, I'll usually set this to H.64, but I actually want to go ahead and color this afterwards. So I'm going to leave it on the Apple ProRes. And then if we just hit render, we want to set the input to global just because we want to work in the 1 to 250 range, and then hit OK, and it should render out. Okay, so finally in DaVinci for the color, we're going to come and just drag and drop the clip into our pool. Go ahead and change the frame rate to match. And then we can just drag that into a new timeline and it should automatically update those settings. I'm going to go ahead and reframe the footage just a little bit. I'm not going to try to do it by too much just because I don't want to, you know, zoom in too much because the pixels aren't as high. It's not 4K. It's only 1080p. So something like that, just so our kind of ball is more in the center there. And since I'm rendering online, it's not going to matter about the quality. And then I'm going to go ahead and go to the color. And this isn't really a coloring tutorial, and I don't really want to do too much with the color. So I'm just going to add a new color corrector node, place it in there. And then for this one, let's just, I have the waveform set down here. So I'm going to decrease the shadows a little bit. You know, affect the lift. Basically just trying to add some contrast in our scene. And you can see that a lot of the data is already cut off here. That's just from the base footage because all these highlights are so super blown out. So there's nothing we can really do there. So that's giving us a lot more contrast. I want to go ahead and maybe mess around a little bit with the saturation. Again, I'm not going to do too much. So that's already looking, you know, a lot better. And honestly, I might just offset it a little bit, something like that. I don't want to clip on the blacks if I don't have to. Let's set like that. And then I want to set the gamma down just a little bit to kind of bring back some more of that contrast. So yeah, so just super minor changes. I don't do a lot of color correcting. And so that's basically that. Again, I'm not a super great expert at color correcting, so definitely look at some tutorials from some experts. But let's go ahead and deliver that. Just gonna save it in a new location, the final location. Name it whatever you want. I'm just gonna name it V2 for mine, and then save. And then all these settings are fine. You can of course change your codec, whatever you want. If you are rendering at a higher, quality level, you might need to render out as something like that. But H.264 is fine for me since this is just going on YouTube. Add to render queue, and finally just hit render all down here, and that should be good. Okay, so here is the final result that we got from this tutorial. Hopefully you guys stuck with it and got a really good result that you're proud of, and hopefully this has taught you how to integrate 3D objects into a scene in Blender and Nuke. If you did like this video, it'd mean a lot to me if you consider liking and subscribing. But anyways, I'll see you in the next one.